Be realistic, Skylar. Women like you don't build empires. He left her with those words and an empty account. 15 years later, she stood on a stage receiving an award he once swore she'd never deserve. As the crowd rose in applause, her eyes found him, smaller now, applauding too. The man who abandoned her had become a spectator in the world she created. And the woman he erased, she was unforgettable. Stay with us, because what begins as heartbreak often ends in power. Every silence they forced on her became an echo that built an empire. Every no they gave her became the reason she rose, and every woman they tried to erase deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be remembered. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever rewritten your own story? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with love, and ring that notification bell for more heartwarming stories that celebrate strength. The first time Skylar Robinson saw Cyrus Thomas, the air itself seemed to pause. It was one of those summer evenings that felt too golden to be real, the kind that makes every stranger look like a possibility. She had been reading at a café near the harbor, her notebook open beside her coffee, when his shadow crossed the table. Cyrus moved like a man who had never known uncertainty. His tailored shirt caught the light, and his smile was practiced but not yet predictable. When he looked at her, it was as if he was already sure she would say yes to whatever he wanted. 23, full of a quiet fire that made people linger when she spoke. She wrote for a small magazine that paid more in compliments than in cash, but she loved it. Her world was built from late nights, thrift store dresses, and dreams that refused to die. Cyrus belonged to another world entirely. He was the kind of man who filled a room without trying, whose name already carried weight among people who measured worth by numbers and inheritance. When he asked her what she did, she told him she wrote stories that made people feel seen. He had smiled in a way that made her believe he understood. They began to meet in the same cafe, then in quiet wine bars and city rooftops where the lights stretched like fallen stars. Cyrus talked about building something lasting, a business that would shape the future. Skylar listened, her mind painting the possibilities in color. When he spoke, she felt herself pulled into his orbit, convinced that this meeting had been written somewhere long before they were born. His confidence felt like protection, and his charm disguised itself as devotion. In those early months, love felt easy. Cyrus sent flowers wrapped in silk ribbons, left notes on her typewriter that made her blush, and looked at her as if she were the rarest thing he had ever found. He told her that her kindness was power, and she believed him because she wanted to. Together they built a rhythm that felt like music. Her laughter softened his edges. His ambition gave her wings. Friends said they were a perfect match, two halves of a promise the world rarely keeps. When they moved into a small loft downtown, Skylar thought she had found her forever. The space was barely larger than a studio, yet every corner carried a trace of their beginning. They painted the walls ivory and wrote their goals on scraps of paper pinned above the bed. On weekends, he worked on his startup while she wrote her stories beside him, the sound of their ambition filling the air like a quiet symphony. There were moments when she caught a flicker in his eyes, something sharp and restless, but she dismissed it as drive. She mistook his hunger for passion, his control for care. She didn't see how often his compliments came with conditions, or how his charm bent the room to his will. When he held her, she thought she was being cherished. In truth, he was already shaping her into something that fit neatly beside him. Still, she loved him without measure. She believed love could heal ambition, that devotion could soften ego. When he promised that they would rise together, she saw a future where her words and his vision built a world of their own. She did not yet know that his love was not a home, but a stage, and she was only the opening act. Their wedding shimmered like something out of a dream. The ballroom was a cathedral of glass and light, every reflection bending the city skyline into something unreal. Skylar moved through the night in a gown that rippled like poured moonlight, her skin glowing against the white marble floors. The guests whispered about her beauty, about the way she carried herself with quiet poise. They said she made Cyrus look more human. He smiled beside her, his arm resting at the small of her back as though claiming something rare. When they danced, she looked up at him with a kind of trust that can only exist before the truth arrives. Married life began with luxury that dazzled even her imagination. Their apartment towered above the city, its windows framing sunsets so wide they seemed to belong only to them. There were mornings when she woke to fresh flowers on the nightstand, and evenings when he came home with new watches or invitations to dinners hosted by people who spoke in numbers instead of names. Skylar adapted quickly. She learned the etiquette of expensive rooms, the art of listening more than she spoke, the smile that made her seem both gracious and unthreatening. But slowly, something in the air began to change. Cyrus's laughter grew shorter, his eyes sharper. Where he once admired her curiosity, he now corrected it. When she shared an idea, he called it sweet but naive. At first, she told herself it was the stress of business, the pressure of keeping his company afloat. But each small correction cut a little deeper. His affection began to feel like a performance designed for others to watch. He held her hand at galas but never reached for it in private. He called her his inspiration in public, yet looked through her at home as though she were part of the furniture. The apartment that once felt like a dream began to feel like a museum. The air was too quiet, the walls too clean. Skylar filled the silence with work, writing stories that reminded her of who she used to be. Sometimes she read them aloud just to hear a voice in the room. Cyrus had started traveling more, disappearing into meetings and returning with a restlessness she couldn't name. When she asked how he was, his answers were short, efficient, like transactions. The loneliness settled slowly, disguised as comfort. Friends said she was lucky, that most women would give anything for her life. She smiled and agreed, even as the weight of that perfection pressed harder on her chest. She started avoiding mirrors, not out of vanity, but because she no longer recognized the woman in them. The sparkle in her eyes had dulled, replaced by the hollow calm of someone trying too hard to seem content. At night, she stood on the balcony, the city lights reflecting off her wedding ring like a distant promise. She told herself that love simply changed shape, that this was what maturity looked like, that silence was proof of stability. What she did not yet understand was that silence is sometimes the sound of something breaking. And though the walls around her gleamed and her life appeared untouched, the foundation beneath it had already begun to crack. The unraveling began quietly, disguised as small inconveniences that no one could trace back to a single cause. Cyrus started coming home later, his explanations brief and his tone clipped. He no longer brought flowers or spoke of the future. The champagne that once marked their victories sat unopened, collecting dust beside the wine rack. When she asked what was wrong, his answers were evasive, hollow, like echoes fading before they reached her. He said the markets were volatile, that investors were losing faith, that he needed space to think. She offered support, thinking love meant patience, unaware that he had already begun building an exit in his mind. The arguments came in flashes that burned and vanished, leaving the air heavy with things unsaid. He accused her of not understanding the pressure he carried, of distracting him from what mattered. When she tried to help, he told her she made things worse. Skylar learned to walk carefully through their home, her words measured, her presence small. Some nights he slept in the guest room, others he didn't come home at all. The company began to falter. She saw it in the way his voice tightened on phone calls, in the unopened mail that piled on the desk, in the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Friends disappeared first, then the employees who used to greet her with practiced smiles. The world that had once seemed invincible began to shrink. Yet even as everything around them trembled, Cyrus refused to let her in. He treated her worry as weakness, her empathy as inconvenience. When the recession struck, it hit like a storm with no warning. Stocks plummeted, clients pulled out, and the empire he had built on confidence began to crumble. Skylar tried to hold them together, cooking dinners he no longer ate, writing him notes he never read. He stayed distant, his face carved into something cold and unreachable. Nights stretched into silence, so thick she could hear the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where their laughter used to be. The final morning came without warning. The sunlight spilled across the marble floors, soft and indifferent. Skylar woke to the sound of emptiness. His closet hung half empty, his cologne gone from the dresser. She walked through each room, as if retracing a dream that no longer belonged to her. In the kitchen, a single sheet of paper waited on the counter. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat and precise. "I need freedom." Nothing more. Her knees weakened, yet she did not cry. She stood there barefoot, the silk of her nightgown clinging to skin that suddenly felt too exposed. Around her, the silence grew larger than the house itself. The cars were gone, the accounts emptied, even the photographs removed from their frames. It was as though he had erased not only himself, but the life they had built. Skylar touched the counter, the cool marble grounding her in a moment she could barely comprehend. The woman who had once glowed under chandeliers now stared at her reflection in the window, the city skyline distorted by her breath. The world outside moved on, unaware that her own had stopped. In that stillness, surrounded by absence, she understood that freedom for him meant disappearance, and survival for her would have to mean beginning again. The first few weeks passed in a blur of noise and fatigue. The constant thrum of washing machines beneath her apartment became the rhythm of her new life. The walls were thin, the floor uneven, but the rent was cheap, and the window caught a sliver of morning light. Skylar learned to live small. She sold her wedding ring to pay her first month's bills and gave away the designer dresses that reminded her of a life that no longer existed. Her furniture came from thrift stores, her meals from dollar menus. Yet every object in that tiny space was hers, earned and honest. Days bled into nights as she pieced together work wherever she could find it. Mornings at the café where the coffee steamed hotter than the gossip, afternoons tutoring children who reminded her of the stories she used to write, and long evenings ghostwriting blog posts for entrepreneurs who would never know her name. She lived on caffeine and determination, her hands always smelling faintly of ink and dish soap. Exhaustion became a companion, not an enemy. People talked, of course. They whispered when she passed them in the grocery store, wondering how the woman who once wore silk and diamonds now stood in line with coupons. Some said she deserved it. Others said it was a shame. Skylar ignored them all. She had no time for pity and no interest in proving anyone wrong. The only thing she wanted was to rebuild something she could call her own. At night, when the world finally quieted, she sat by the window with a notebook and a pen. Ideas spilled from her mind faster than she could write them down. Plans for small businesses, marketing concepts, community projects. Each one began as a sketch, a whisper of a dream that might one day pay off. She wrote until her hand cramped, the pages filled with words that felt like oxygen. Every idea was a step away from who she had been and a step closer to who she was becoming. Some evenings, she would glance at the skyline beyond her window. The towers where she once lived glowed like distant stars, unreachable but no longer painful to look at. She thought about Cyrus sometimes, not with anger, but with clarity. He had taken the comfort, but not her courage. He had walked away, but she had stayed standing. The struggle reshaped her. She became sharper, stronger, more certain of what mattered. She learned to negotiate pay without apologizing. She discovered how to fix a leaky faucet, how to stretch a meal for 2 days, how to keep moving even when everything hurt. What began as survival slowly became strategy. Her resilience hardened into something beautiful, a quiet kind of power that asked for nothing but effort. Years would pass before anyone recognized her name again, but in that small apartment above the hum of machines, Skylar had already begun the work of transformation. Every bill she paid, every word she wrote, every morning she woke up and tried again was a brick in the foundation of the life she was building. She did not yet know it, but the empire she would one day rule had already begun to take shape between those sleepless nights and ink-stained dreams. It happened on an ordinary night, the kind of evening that smelled of coffee grounds and disinfectant. Skylar was wiping down tables at the cafe when 2 women near the window caught her attention. Their voices carried the frustration of dreamers on the edge of giving up. One spoke of her bakery that couldn't afford marketing, the other of a clothing line she ran from her kitchen table. They said success felt like a locked door with no key. Skylar paused, cloth in hand, listening. Their words echoed something she understood too well. The exhaustion of building alone, the hunger to be seen, the quiet fear of fading before the world noticed. When she went home that night, she couldn't stop thinking about them. She stared at her notebook, the same one filled with late-night sketches and half-finished plans, and began writing again. But this time, the ideas were not about saving herself. They were about helping others like them. People who worked hard, dreamed harder, and still found themselves invisible in a world built for someone else. The next morning, she printed flyers offering business storytelling and brand clarity for startups. It was a phrase she made up on the spot, but it caught attention. Her first client was a woman who sold handmade candles at weekend markets. Skylar helped her design a brand that told her story, the way she mixed scents inspired by her grandmother's garden. Within weeks, sales doubled. Word spread quickly, not through advertising, but through trust. Skylar didn't have investors or a fancy office, only a deep understanding of struggle, and that became her advantage. Her empathy was magnetic. She spoke the language of ambition softened by reality, of people who built things with bare hands and borrowed courage. Soon she was consulting for small boutiques, bakeries, fitness studios. Each client brought new lessons, and each success stitched back a piece of her confidence. She began to see patterns, how businesses failed not because they lacked talent, but because they lacked guidance, connection, and belief. She decided to build something that could give them all 3. In a co-working space she rented by the hour, she launched Aurora Collective. The name came to her one night while watching the dawn from her window. The sky shifted from darkness to light in waves of color, and she thought, this is what it feels like to rise again. She painted the words on a piece of scrap wood and placed it above her desk. That desk became the heart of her vision. Aurora grew faster than she expected. Within months, she was mentoring young entrepreneurs, creating workshops for minority-owned brands, and forming partnerships with community organizations. The press called her an innovator. She smiled at the irony. She had only ever been trying to survive. Yet, as her client list expanded and her reputation spread, something deeper settled in her chest. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by what she was creating. 3 years after that night in the cafe, Aurora Collective occupied an entire floor of a downtown building. The walls were filled with color and laughter, the kind of energy that comes from people who believe in what they're doing. Skylar stood by the window one morning, watching the city wake beneath her. The same skyline that once mocked her now reflected her light back at her. She had built something enduring, not from privilege but from pain, transformed into purpose. Success arrived not with fanfare but with a quiet inevitability. Aurora had become the name whispered in boardrooms and printed on glossy covers, the story of a woman who turned survival into strategy. Skylar appeared on magazine pages where she had once only been a footnote beside someone else's wealth. Her smile in those photographs was calm, deliberate, the kind that revealed little but suggested everything. The reporters called her graceful, driven, magnetic. None of them knew that grace had been carved from nights of uncertainty, that drive had been born from loss, that magnetism had come only after she stopped needing approval. Her life unfolded in a rhythm that balanced visibility with restraint. She gave speeches about entrepreneurship and empowerment, but never lingered in the spotlight longer than necessary. The attention that once might have flattered her now felt like responsibility. She made sure her platform amplified others, designers, founders, women who were told their dreams were too small or too different. When she spoke about success, she refused to frame it in numbers. She spoke of integrity, of staying kind when the world turned cruel, of leading with empathy in rooms that had forgotten what that word meant. Her style became its own language, tailored cream suits that moved like confidence, gold jewelry that caught the light in quiet defiance, hair pulled back to reveal eyes that never looked away. She was no longer the woman who had waited for validation at someone else's table. She had built her own, and she chose carefully who sat at it. Yet behind the elegance lay discipline. Her mornings began before dawn with silence and reflection. Her days stretched long into evenings of meetings, mentorships, and strategy sessions. The work consumed her, but it did not deplete her. It filled the spaces once hollowed out by disappointment. Still, success brought its own ghosts. Invitations began arriving from the very circles that had once turned their backs. Charity galas, industry panels, private dinners, each one dressed in the same kind of polished exclusivity she remembered too well. She attended only when it mattered, always composed, always in control. In those rooms, eyes followed her the way they once had, but the meaning behind the glances had shifted. Pity had turned into admiration, condescension into curiosity. Skylar accepted it all with the poise of someone who no longer needed permission to belong. There were moments when she caught her reflection in a window and barely recognized herself. The girl who once scrubbed cafe tables now directed entire teams, advised governments, and funded initiatives that changed lives. Yet beneath the surface, she remained anchored to the same truth. Every accolade was a reminder, not a prize. She never wanted to become what she had once escaped. Aurora continued to grow, expanding into new cities, shaping new industries. Awards filled her office shelves, though she rarely looked at them. What mattered most were the stories she heard from others who said her courage had sparked their own. The woman who had once been left behind now stood unshaken at the center of her own creation. She had not just survived, she had refused to disappear. The years had not been kind to Cyrus Thomas. The sharpness that once defined him had dulled into weariness, and the confidence that had carried him through rooms now trembled beneath the weight of defeat. The financial empire he had built with arrogance and ambition had collapsed in waves, each loss dragging him further from the man he used to be. What remained was debt, regret, and the hollow echo of a name that no longer opened doors. He had seen her face for the first time in years on the cover of a magazine at an airport kiosk. Skylar Robinson, founder of Aurora Collective, advocate for economic equity. The image stopped him cold. Her posture was elegant, her gaze steady, her presence commanding in a way that pulled the air out of his lungs. She looked untouchable, radiant, and unafraid. The article described her as a visionary reshaping industries, a woman whose empathy had become her power. He stared at her eyes the longest. They were the same eyes that had once searched his for affection. Now they looked beyond him entirely. Days later, he stood in the lobby of her headquarters, a building whose glass walls shimmered in the morning light. He had told himself he came only to discuss business, but the truth was heavier. He was out of options, and she had become the one person whose success might save him. The irony clung to him like sweat. He had once left her for freedom. Now freedom had left him for her. The receptionist asked for his name, typing it politely without recognition. Cyrus hesitated before speaking, unsure how to define himself anymore. He rehearsed what he would say if she agreed to see him, how he would talk about collaboration, not charity. Yet even as he stood there, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of her world, he felt the imbalance. Everything about the space reflected her presence. The art on the walls, the calm energy in the air, the staff who moved with purpose. This was not the world he had built. It was hers. When Skylar finally appeared at the far end of the hall, the sound of her heels striking the marble echoed like a verdict. She walked with the same grace she had always possessed, only now it carried authority. Her cream suit was perfectly tailored, her gold earrings glinting softly in the light. For a moment she didn't recognize him. Then their eyes met, and time folded in on itself. The silence between them was heavy with history, with everything broken and everything rebuilt. He managed to whisper her name, but she didn't respond. Her expression was calm, unreadable, her face framed by composure that years of struggle had perfected. She studied him the way one studies a relic of a life long gone. Then, with the faintest nod, she invited him to follow her into her office. Cyrus moved behind her, each step an echo of choices he could never undo. The walls around them gleamed with achievement, the very reflection of what he had once promised her but failed to deliver. As the door closed behind them, he realized he wasn't entering a negotiation. He was walking into the truth of what she had become, and the shadow of what he had lost. The boardroom was quiet, except for the faint hum of the city below. Morning light filtered through the glass walls, washing the space in silver. Skylar stood near the window, her reflection layered against the skyline that had once defined their beginning. Cyrus sat at the long table, his hands clasped, his posture an imitation of composure. Between them stretched the distance of 15 years and everything it had cost. He began to speak first, his voice measured, rehearsed. He talked about the economy, about partnerships and mutual benefit. He spoke of potential synergies and new ventures, his words dressed in business language meant to hide the tremor underneath. Skylar said nothing. She let him talk, her silence both permission and judgment. The more he spoke, the smaller his voice seemed to become, swallowed by the glass and light. When he finally ran out of sentences, the room felt emptier than before. Skylar turned toward him, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Her poise was not the performance it had once been. It was the result of having stood alone long enough to no longer fear solitude. She walked to the head of the table and rested her hand lightly on its surface. The gesture was subtle, but it reclaimed the room entirely. Cyrus tried again, this time softer. He spoke of regret, of the mistakes he made, of the love he once felt but did not know how to keep. He said he wanted to make amends, that together they could rebuild something new. For a fleeting second, he almost sounded sincere. Yet beneath every word lingered the same hunger that had driven him before, the need to possess what he could not create. Skylar's eyes held him without anger. She had imagined this moment once, back when pain had still felt raw enough to demand explanation. But standing here now, she realized she no longer needed one. Closure had already arrived the day she stopped needing his apology. She spoke quietly, her tone even and unwavering. She told him that he had not broken her. He had only revealed what she was capable of. She reminded him that survival had been her crucible, and that the empire he saw now had been built from the ashes he left behind. Her voice carried no bitterness, only truth. Every word landed with precision, stripping away the illusion he had wrapped himself in. Cyrus's shoulders sank as the reality settled in. He looked at her not as an ex-wife, not as a rival, but as someone who had outgrown him in every way that mattered. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. For the first time, he saw her clearly, not the woman who once waited for him to come home, but the one who no longer needed him to. Skylar gathered her files, her movements unhurried. As she walked past him, she paused only once, her gaze lingering on him with quiet finality. Her voice was low, steady, and absolute. "You left me to survive, and I did more than that. I built what you could never imagine." Then she left the boardroom, the echo of her heels fading into the hall. Cyrus remained seated, staring at the city he no longer owned, haunted by the truth that his freedom had cost him the one thing he could never replace. Cyrus returned to her office a week later, not as a partner or equal, but as a man stripped of pretense. The arrogance that once carried him had vanished, replaced by the quiet confusion of someone learning how to begin again. Skylar greeted him without warmth or hostility. Her tone was professional, her demeanor calm. She handed him a folder that outlined Aurora's mentorship program for entrepreneurs who had lost everything. His name was already listed among the applicants. The look in his eyes faltered. For the first time, he understood the terms of her grace. It would not come as pity, but as accountability. The sessions took place in a modest conference room far removed from the glamour of her main office. The people seated beside him were small business owners, artists, and dreamers trying to rebuild after failure. They introduced themselves one by one, their voices carrying stories of debt, loss, and starting over. Cyrus listened, each word cutting deeper than any financial loss he had ever faced. These were people he once would have ignored, yet here he was, one of them. Skylar watched from the back, silent but attentive. She offered guidance when needed, but mostly she let humility do its quiet work. Over time, the mentorship group became something more than a program. It was a reflection of Skylar's philosophy, success measured not by what you owned, but by what you restored. She taught them how to see opportunity in failure, how to rebuild not from desperation, but from purpose. When the press discovered that her former husband was among the attendees, they spun the story into headlines. The woman he abandoned now teaching him how to stand again. She refused interviews, letting her actions speak instead. The world began to call her a symbol of forgiveness, of resilience, of triumph. But those who worked beside her knew she had no interest in symbols. Every morning she arrived before her staff, walking the halls with quiet intention. She still mentored single mothers in evening workshops, still visited neighborhoods where Aurora funded youth programs and business grants. Her empire was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of communities she refused to leave behind. The wealth she accumulated flowed outward into scholarships, local markets, and shelters that bore no plaques with her name. When she stood before audiences, her speeches were never about victory. They were about grace, how to extend it without losing strength, how to lead without forgetting where you started. People often asked how she managed to forgive him, but she never used that word. Forgiveness implied release, and she had not needed to release anything. She had simply chosen to rise higher than the wound. Cyrus attended the final mentorship session months later, sitting near the window as she closed the meeting. Her words filled the room like light. She spoke of rebuilding not from pride, but from gratitude, of finding meaning in the ashes of failure. As the group applauded, Cyrus looked down at his hands, realizing he was no longer trying to regain what he lost. He was learning from the one who had mastered what he never could. Skylar lingered after the session ended, watching the sunset burn through the skyline. The city glowed gold, alive, and infinite. She knew her empire would continue to grow, not because of her power, but because of her grace. What she built was not wealth. It was restoration made visible. The ballroom shimmered under a canopy of lights, each crystal reflecting a fragment of her journey. Skylar stood at the center of it all, her silhouette poised against a backdrop of applause. The announcer's words faded into the hum of camera shutters and the rustle of gowns. She accepted the award with a steady hand, the weight of it cool against her skin. It was engraved with her name, but in her mind, it carried the names of all those who had walked with her. The mothers who dared to dream again, the entrepreneurs who rebuilt, the communities that rose. As the applause swelled, she looked out over the crowd. Rows of faces beamed up at her, their admiration polished and sincere. Near the back, almost hidden in shadow, she saw him, Cyrus. Older, smaller somehow, his posture softened by time. He clapped with the same hands that had once built empires and burned bridges. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat, but it was enough. In his gaze, she saw no envy, no bitterness, only recognition. The life he had walked away from had become everything he had once claimed to want. The speech she delivered was brief, but grounded in truth. She spoke not of success, but of service, not of empire, but of empathy. Her voice carried a calm authority, the kind that silenced rooms without needing to raise itself. She thanked the communities that had shaped her, the mentors she had met along the way, and the countless people who had reminded her that rebuilding the world began with rebuilding one another. When she stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation. She smiled, but it wasn't pride that filled her. It was peace. Outside, the night air felt cool against her skin. The city stretched before her like an endless constellation of light. Glass towers rose into the dark sky, reflecting the glow of the streets below. She looked up at one of them, a building she now owned shares in, and felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The noise from the gala softened behind her, replaced by the faint rhythm of passing cars and distant laughter. Cyrus stepped out moments later, lingering a few feet away. He didn't approach, didn't speak. He simply watched her, the realization etched across his face that some losses are permanent because they were meant to be. Skylar turned slightly, meeting his eyes with a nod that carried both closure and compassion. There was no triumph in her expression, only grace. He returned the nod, his applause from earlier still echoing faintly between them. She walked toward her car, the hem of her gown sweeping softly over the pavement. The city lights shimmered across the hood, glinting like promises fulfilled. As she paused before getting in, she glanced at the skyline one last time. 15 years ago, she had been left with nothing but her name. Now that name stood for something larger than wealth, something enduring. She had built not just an empire, but a world where others could rise. And in that still moment, under the quiet hum of her city, Skylar Robinson finally allowed herself to exhale. Before you go, take a moment to remember what Skylar taught us. Being left behind is not the end. It's the beginning of your becoming. Someone you know is standing at that same edge, wondering if they'll ever rise again. Share this video with them. Let them see that survival is not weakness. It's preparation for power. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.